Going to give Leo a second. There we go. Hey everyone, welcome to the webinar. Glad to have you people here who are here early, but as usual, we're just going to give a few moments for more people to join the live session here at the beginning. But while we're waiting, I will just quickly introduce the speakers we've got from Lunio here today. So first up, we've got David Triger, CTO at Lunio. How are you today, David? Are you? I don't know about your apartment, David, but we're all three of us are in Manchester. It's super warm at the minute, and there's no air conditioning anywhere in Manchester.
Yeah,
I'm like really struggling. Are you the same?
Yeah, to be honest, I just relocated from Israel a few years ago, and one of the main reasons was the weather. And I feel that I've been cheated. Like, where's the rains?
Yeah. Well, I came from Ireland, so it was just coming from one rainy country to another rainy country. So it's been pretty much rain all 30 years of my entire life. But what can you do? We've also got Leo Pizarro, Lunio's head of demand gen. How are you today, Leo?
Very warm.
Very
warm. I think the curse of living in the city center is you have to close your windows to block out the noise. So this office space is slowly turning into a sauna.
Yeah, it's the sleeping at night. Like that's the thing that gets me. It's really hard to get a good night's sleep, but we'll do what we can today. I know, Leo, you're going away on holiday at the end of September. You're going to some place I'd never heard of before in my life. Where is it again that you're going?
To Eifling. So I'm going to Amsterdam and then Eifling in the Netherlands.
Yeah.
You know what? I might bump into Bob and Miles there. And
nice.
Couple
Previous
of other
webinar, I guess.
Big marketers. We'll see. So I'll have to message them about it.
I'm sure they can point you in the direction of some good spots in Amsterdam. But you're going to a theme park, right? Like a big.
Yes, a big spooky theme park. I don't know much about it, but yeah, if you Google Eifling's theme park, it looks like a spooky version of Disneyland.
Nice. So we've had a couple more people join, and I do have some housekeeping and some other bits and pieces to get through. So I'll just start running through some of that now. Again, welcome to those of you who've just joined, and welcome whether you're here at the live session or watching back on demand. For those that don't know, my name is James. I'm the content manager here at Lunio, and today I'll just be hosting the webinar, asking the questions to both David and Leo, and attempting to keep us on track for time. So today we're aiming for around 35 to 40 minutes to get through the content, and then we will have a 10 to 15 minute period at the end for Q&A, which I'll say more about in a second. But as you probably know, the title of today's webinar is Invalid Traffic Explained. And as you'd expect, we'll be diving into the various different forms of invalid traffic, the signs of IVT you can look out for in your analytics, as well as strategies and resources you can use to reduce your exposure to IVT. This webinar does follow up from our recently published 2024 Wasted Ad Spend Report, which was produced in partnership with Integral Ad Science and Scope 3. We published that report last week, and you can download that now for free, and you can find it in the Docs tab here in Goldcast next to where the chat is. And if you do find it useful, please do forward it on. We all worked very hard on it here. Leo was helping to write certain sections of it in conjunction with me to make sure that we could meet the deadlines. And at times I was having like flashbacks to university where I left some of my projects to the last minute to try and get things done. But anyway, if you find the report useful, letting another marketer know about it, you can consider that your good deed done for the day. In that Docs tab, while you're there, you can also find additional resources, including Lunio's 100K placement exclusion list, which you can use to reduce your exposure to IVT through Google display campaigns. So do check that out in the Docs tab. Also, if you weren't aware, this is the second webinar in a 3-part series. And if you missed the first one with IAS and Scope 3, you can go back now and watch that back on demand. There is a link to the recording of that first webinar, again, in the Docs tab. And the next webinar, the final webinar in the series, will be the same time next Thursday with Leo and Dan Hickson, Lunio Sales Director, where they'll be exploring the ins and outs of the Lunio platform itself and how to get as much value as possible from the product. So if you're interested in seeing exactly how Lunio can help you eliminate wasted spend from your campaigns, please do join us next Thursday as well. Just a few other very quick bits before we get into the agenda today. We are recording today's session again, and it will also be available to watch back on demand. We will be creating a brief written recap of today's webinar and posting that on the Lunio blog early next week. So be on the lookout for that. And earlier I mentioned the Q&A. If you do have any questions for either David or Leo, if you see the Q&A tab there next to the Docs tab, if you could just pop your question in there, it prevents the question from being lost in the chat, and we'll get round to those at the end of the session. In the Q&A tab, you can also upvote questions which have been asked by other people, which is obviously helpful for us when we're reviewing them. We'll also be running a few audience polls during the session, which you can vote on in the polls tab. So please do give us your responses there. And you should see a notification pop up whenever a new poll is open in that tab for responses. So on that note, we'll just bring up our first poll question here, which isn't strictly IVT related, but it is something interesting. I know, Leo, this is something that you've been thinking about recently. So are you planning on trying TikTok's new search ads? So Leo, could you first of all outline for us what those search ads are?
Yeah, so I guess it's for anyone familiar with search ads on Google, and I assume most people would attending this webinar. Search ads are one of the very few inbound pay channels. So when you think of advertising, most advertising is outbound, as in we're pushing out a message to a person more often than not at the wrong time. And with it being inbound, this is the person actually searching for that query or searching for that answer. I think it's a bold move, a wise move from TikTok, enabling that. So while you're searching for whatever piece of content on TikTok, you can now have placements that are targeting that search query. Also, some very interesting insights shared by Rise at 7, an agency that we have worked with in the past. TikTok is considered to be one of, if not the most popular search engine, surpassing Google right now. So particularly in the younger generations. So TikTok is really leveraging the search function within their platform.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I think is quite unique about TikTok, in that it does have that quite a high search volume. Whereas, you know, if they were to try and do the same thing on a different platform like LinkedIn or Meta, it might not work as well. But do you think that they'll probably try to follow suit?
Yep, I think LinkedIn and Meta will follow something similar. Not as much as so I think it would have to be search related, but again, it might come down to having different placements for that. So the same way as you would search for queries on LinkedIn or being part of certain groups, ideally finding a way to target users at the right time. So this is one of the biggest challenges with social media advertising, is that you're often targeting the right person because you have that targeting criteria set, but they're not interested to buy or read your content because they're on social browsing and doing something completely different. So it's how do you find that sweet spot? And I think ad platforms or social media platforms are now trying to develop that. Yeah,
nice. So just to bring the topic back to invalid traffic and the content that we'll be running through today, we've got 7 main points to cover on the agenda. So first, we'll be diving into what invalid traffic is and the different forms it can take. After that, we'll talk about general invalid traffic versus sophisticated invalid traffic, or GIVT versus SIVT. Then we'll cover what IVT looks like and the signs of IVT to look out for in your analytics platforms. Then we will discuss the current state of invalid traffic in 2023. Then we'll dive into what ad networks are doing to address and combat invalid traffic. Then how Lunio detects IVT that ad networks don't catch, before wrapping up with some marketing best practices and resources to reduce wasted spend on IVT with some actionable approaches there. So that's enough from me for now. So we'll just get into the main content here. So David, if you could kick us off first of all by just kind of give us a top level overview of what invalid traffic is.
So invalid traffic is activities that doesn't come from a real user or has no genuine interest behind it. This is the very basic definition of it.
And I think there's lots of different forms. So immediately when you think of invalid traffic, like it has a negative connotation. But Leo, I think it's important to remember the fact that as well as bad bots, quote unquote, we can also have good bots. So could you talk to us about what good bots are and what some of examples of those might be?
Yeah, so I suppose good bots, when I think of good bots, I think of mostly web crawlers. So crawlers that typically surf the web, follow links. That would be your Bing bot, your Google bot. Bots that typically get pages to get indexed in the first place.
Yeah, there's a lot of that activity going on. And then one of the other things that might not necessarily spring to mind immediately when we hear the term invalid traffic is accidental clicks from real humans. But David, could you just talk us just briefly about that kind of IVT and how prevalent that tends to be?
Yeah, so the problems there is that it's much harder to tell that it was invalid because the source is human-like, so the activity is quite human-like, but you don't need to prove that this click had no intention or had no value to the advertiser, right? So an accidental click can still cost money without bringing you any value, so it will be invalid traffic, but it's a whole different level of trying to detect it, especially if there was no specific or organized intent behind it.
Yeah, you can imagine that's you need to be quite careful, I suppose, about what you do and don't block, and there's a lot that goes into that. So if we then look a bit more about different forms of IVT. So I briefly mentioned sophisticated IVT or SIVT. But before we talk about that, Leo, I think it's important to clear up what we mean by general invalid traffic and the characteristics of GIVT. So could you talk us through some of those?
Yeah. By the way, super proud that we managed to get BenderBot approved to have it on the slide. So it's a great representation of what general or generic invalid traffic looks like. So I think general invalid traffic is, in its most basic form, your average invalid traffic that is generated by non-malicious activity, or mostly non-malicious activity. So part of that group, you have your good bots, so web crawlers. You also have some other basic automation, automation rules that come from open source tools. So a couple of these tools can run basic automated scripts. They are limited to ISP-assigned IP addresses. However, these type of tools can't often execute JavaScript. They're very easily identifiable by most app platforms and legacy click fraud solutions. However, these bots cannot identify captchas. They're very basic, and we tend to call these yesterday's type of bots. The reason why we call them yesterday's types of bots is if a bot does have malicious intent and is actually looking to perform some kind of action to bypass rules, then you're dealing with mostly sophisticated invalid traffic.
Yeah, well, we'll talk a bit about that in a sec. But just on the topic of Bender, I don't know, have you seen any of the new episodes of Futurama that they brought out, the reboot after the 10-year break?
No, I actually wasn't aware there was a reboot.
Did you not? No, well,
Thanks.
I wasn't aware, but my friend, he let me know that, yeah, I don't know where they're publishing a new episode. It's coming out each week, so you can't binge watch the entire season. But yeah, for any Futurama fans out there, if you're like Leo and you weren't aware that there is a new season, I think it launched just at the end of July. So a little bonus to go check out there. But as you mentioned at the end of your point there, Leo, when we're looking at bots performing more complicated actions, generally tends to be sophisticated invalid traffic. So it's going to be harder to detect that kind of traffic. It'd be harder for ad platforms and for legacy IVT prevention solutions. So could you just talk us through some of the key characteristics of sophisticated invalid traffic?
Yeah, so I suppose sophisticated invalid traffic is what you would commonly call ad fraud, or what you could place in the ad fraud bucket. So it's a type of activity that's much harder to detect. It uses methods that emulate human behavior, so using things such as legitimate IP addresses, and rotating these IP addresses to try and bypass static methods of blocking bots. It can store cookies. It can emulate click patterns that mimic human behavior as well. I think one of the most frustrating things of this type of invalid traffic is that it blends in with your website traffic. It's very hard to detect. And it comes in the form, quite often it comes in the form of what we call a low and slow attack, which is it identifies the patterns of your website, and it will try and blend in with your activity without you really being able to identify whether there is a peak in traffic or not. So it will understand whether, let's say, if we have a Black Friday period coming up and retailers are generating 50 to 100% more genuine traffic, then you would have these nefarious visits trying to increase the amount of invalid traffic to kind of match that rate. We call this the Terminator because they are back consistently one way or another.
Yeah, very threatening looking picture of Arnie there. Yeah, I know he's got a new series on Netflix as well. I haven't watched that, but there was people talking about that new Arnie series that's come out. But yeah, I can't vouch for that one. I haven't watched it. Aside from GIVT and SIVT, another term that tends to crop up a lot is fake users. So Leo, what do we mean by the term fake user, and how do they fit into this overall picture of invalid traffic?
So I think when we talk about fake users, I suppose invalid traffic or invalid activity, fake users would be a subset of it. Fake users is almost the part that's visible to the user, as in you can see this can come in the form of spam leads, fake users on social, which is quite common. They're visible to the user, but you still don't know whether they're legitimate or not. Very, very common on social platforms, and we've seen the rise of fake user activity with the rise of AI. Platforms like Meta and LinkedIn are cracking down on fake user profiles. So profiles that require images and verification, they are working on that. However, these platforms are also seeing the highest rates of invalid traffic based on our last report. I think the reason for that is, aside from there being quite a big opportunity for these fake users to exploit these platforms, I think particularly LinkedIn, with it being a business platform, you also have a lot of fake users that are purely created for scraping data. So you can create a user, you can buy these users in bulk off the website. You can associate them with tools, and you can just run scrapers. They're almost like a mule. So you run them until LinkedIn bans them, and then you just use another profile with the cookie session, and you run that scraping tool. And this can be done, thousands at a time. I think that is the scary bit when you think of these scrapers that would typically scrape any piece of content, including advertising URLs. So all those clicks that you typically see in your platform and you can't match against those engagements, do consider that some of those would be coming from scrapers.
That's a really good point. And I think we were speaking earlier today, and you had mentioned an experiment that we had run on Meta in particular, and looking at the Advantage Plus audience expansion feature and some of the kind of fake engagement you were seeing there. So could you talk a bit more about what that experiment was and what we saw?
Yeah, so I guess Advantage Plus, very similar to Performance Max, when it did get launched, it got a lot of eyebrows raised, and we just wanted to see how much it has changed since the launch date. We decided to run an experiment without Lunio. It was a lead gen experiment. So what we did was we set it a target cost per lead. It was actually for this very, very webinar series that we ran it against. And within 24 hours, we generated 200 signups, so 200 registrations. And seeing that result immediately, on one side, we saw the obviously significant increase in leads coming through, 200 potential leads in a day. We were amazed. But then when looking at the cost per lead, something seemed off. Our cost per lead was 0.07, or it was in the cents. So we downloaded the list, and we found 200 email addresses, all with the same format: first name, last name, year or date of birth, at Gmail or at Hotmail, whatever domain it might be. So it was exactly that same email format. And then when we looked at timestamps, they all came in reasonably around the same amount of time frame. So again, this is a great example of, you have these leads, potential leads that come through. It becomes very hard to validate them, especially if they're personal email addresses. But even if they're business email addresses, there has been cases where you might get a legitimate business email address, but it turns out it hasn't been the person that actually submitted it. And I think these are some of the dangers that we're seeing with ad platforms, especially with advertisers that rely on those performance metrics.
Yeah, 100%. And I know in the Wasted Ad Spend report, we conducted a survey of performance marketers, and there was overwhelming majority of marketers, I think it was 70% of respondents, experiencing similar things where they're having problems with fake lead submissions across multiple different platforms. So this is an ongoing issue. I know issues with fake leads via Performance Max, that's kind of well documented, and people are doing what they can to combat that, but the problem isn't just limited to Performance Max. So David, just to bring you in here, when it comes to detecting IVT, how can machine learning models pick up what's non-human that a human would never be able to see on their own?
So the amount of dimensions that human can grasp is quite finite. You can think about a dot, then a line, then maybe a chessboard, and then a cube, right? And when you look at different data, each input will be practically a dimension, right? So there's that much that you can visualize for a human to analyze at the time. So either you try to manually combine all the different permutations of the dimension that you're looking at, for example, the time of the click, the keyword, the campaign, the country. There's a lot of things that you could look at, basically all the signals that you have. And it will be quite hard to do something that will visualize all the possible combinations for a human. At the same time, machine learning, what it allows us to do is it allows us to analyze patterns on an unlimited amount of dimensions, limited only by the hardware that we dedicate to it, and to learn some of those patterns and to be able to predict in real time, basically within seconds, whether the activity that's going on right now resembles an activity that we are certain that was invalid, a cluster of activity that we are certain that was invalid. And that's not something that a human will be able to do, even if they were presented with all the data on the screen, basically.
And are you able to, so there are certain cases where it's just certain that this traffic is invalid, and then I presume there are other cases where there's less certainty, but it's highly likely that it's invalid?
Yeah. So obviously it is a matter of confidence. Some traffic can be proven to be originating from a competitor, for example, or from an attack that was not necessarily directed at the marketing spend, but did end up hitting the marketing ads, for example. If somebody was trying to exhaust the resources of a company, either by denial of service or by other means, one of those methods could be exhaustion of ad spend, right? And there are patterns which give very high confidence that this is the case. On the other end, for example, when we approach huge events like the Black Friday, some of the legitimate activity might look like a spike, which could be attributed, obviously, to either a legitimate intent or a legitimate growth of sales, or to a competitor trying to bring your e-commerce shop down so that the customers will go to them instead of you. So that's where the problem originates, and that's why it's quite a challenge to do.
Very interesting. Yeah. Well, Black Friday's coming up soon. I know it's on a lot of people's minds. Leo, we've got two different graphs on the screen here on the slide. So could you just briefly talk us through what these two different graphs represent and how they resemble what marketers deal with on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah. So I guess looking at this chart, it really does hit home, especially prior to moving into Lunio. And I guess for some context, before moving to Lunio, for anyone that doesn't know in the chat, I used to be a Lunio customer. And even before knowing about invalid traffic, despite working in like the bot management industry, I would typically just live in Google Analytics, Google Ads, often look at the CRM to match that data. But it was very apparent to me that there were major data discrepancies between the CRM app platforms and your web analytics platforms. Mainly the web analytics platforms and your advertising platforms, because you might have data points that Google records, so number of clicks, whatever it might be. Google Analytics is telling you that actually you've had less visits than you actually did based on Google Ads, because your website might choose to filter some of those visits out. And then when it came to conversions, every app platform is fighting for conversion attribution. So that would typically be much higher than what you would see in the CRM. And I guess the bit that really hits home is when you start looking at the graph on the left and you look at the graph on the right, I mean, you can't really tell, aside from the peaks in traffic that you're seeing on the left graph. I mean, this could be seasonality. And quite often we would see certain days like Wednesdays and Thursdays being particularly popular within the business. But then we would also see those invalid traffic levels match that same trend. And it's almost scary when you start working with Lunio and look into the data that actually Lunio uncovers to see how well some of these invalid data points can blend in and how much of your activity can actually take over.
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely worth looking into and getting a hold of that data to cross-reference. David, thinking about the next kind of stage in the bot's journey, I guess. I know this is a fairly broad and open-ended question, but could you run us through the different kind of scenarios that can occur if a bot converts after the click?
So that's a bit more of a philosophical question, I would say. So let's assume that you don't know if the bot was, like, what's the reasons of the bot? What was the intent behind it? Was it just a Google trawler? Was it a competitor trying to exhaust your budget? Or maybe somebody is just reselling your product, right? Now, what if a bot converts? Now, one of the challenges we have in the industry that we are in is that you cannot just say that whatever converts is good, because then just one conversion will grant you immunity from being blocked, right? So where do you draw the line? And it's an ongoing challenge that we tackle on per industry, I would say, basis. And there's no one answer to that. So there's quite a bit of different answers. And what we need to do is we provide the tools to make the best decisions about those kind of things. And there's a lot of investment on the product side that will allow getting a bit more control about what you deem to be valid in terms of conversion when those kind of things happen, those kind of outliers. But obviously, if you are only looking at the cybersecurity aspect of it and marking every bot as invalid, you might be losing quite a big opportunity and quite a big share of your market of people that will actually convert or bots that will actually convert. It is quite an open-ended question. Very much happy to discuss it in the Q&As, but there's not one good answer that would answer every single case when that happens.
Yeah, that's understandable. And Leo, I know we kind of touched on discrepancies in analytics previously, but I know there are some kind of signs that you can pay attention for that might indicate that there is some level of invalid activity going on. So could you talk us through things that people should maybe pay attention to when they're looking at their analytics?
Yeah, I'll be quick with this one. I think the main 2 points actually come to mind are traffic peaks with low conversion rates, and unexpectedly high CPAs. And then a couple of the points on the slides there are actually correlated to what we see based on customer engagement after using Lunio. So after using Lunio, we typically see a reduction in bounce rates and an increase in session duration. And that seems very consistent with having Lunio in place. So if you are seeing traffic, particularly from display, with high bounce rates and low session duration, I think most marketers know that, again, if you can filter on your analytics to look at display only traffic, you will see like 90% plus bounce rates and a session duration of possibly 10, if not less, 5 to 10 seconds. You definitely have an issue with invalid traffic there. Aside from that, I'd say any kind of data discrepancy you're seeing in the platform is a yellow or red flag. Like, you have to look into why certain data points don't match.
Yeah. It takes time to do that, but it can pay off if you find the source of that. This next stat, I remember I was just shocked when I first came across this. I think it was a few months ago now. But basically, this slide is representing the Imperva 2023 bad bot report, which found that in 2022, nearly half, 47.4% of all internet traffic came from bots, which was a 5.1% over the previous year. And someone who hadn't spent a huge amount of time looking at this, I was just kind of on the face of that quite shocked. But David, very, very briefly, why is this number increasing, and is it likely to continue increasing on this trend that Imperva have found in this report?
Yeah, it's quite easy to explain, actually. There's a law called Moore's law, where the computing power nearly doubles every 2 years, with some adjustments, obviously, which means that the power of hardware is growing much faster than the population, or even the population that has access to the internet. And it's going to be the trend for quite a while.
So, is it feasible or plausible to think that in 5 or 10 years that number could be as high as 60 or 70%, or is it just like too hard to say, or like
it really depends on how much preventive action is going to be taken by the major industry players. Like, if there's going to be any form of bioverification involved, for example, to be able to browse the internet. So those are quite far-fetched, like Terminator scenarios, obviously. I would say it is quite likely, if we do nothing and give it just 10 years, that we are going to be in the single digits of real activity across the web, not only advertisers, but across the whole web. And
I think one of the main points to touch on here is, obviously now we're living in the era of automation and AI, and as you suggested in your answer there, that is contributing to the problem. But could you talk, and perhaps specifically with reference to a tool like ChatGPT, how that can actually contribute to this whole problem and make it worse?
Yeah, so there's quite a big spike. It's similar to when everybody got access to the internet like 30 years ago. Now, much more of the population have access to building tools, specifically bots, without knowing the basics of technology required to do it. So you can go to ChatGPT, ask it to do something. It might decline. Then you can ask it to not to do it, and you get the Python code to DDoS a website, basically. So yeah, this is why it's becoming more and more easier. Just the tools are becoming more and more accessible, and there's less knowledge that you need in order to be able to write one and operate one.
Yeah, I know. I've listened to other podcasts and stuff, and people are talking about, on the one hand, this democratization of these really powerful tools like ChatGPT can be positive in many different ways, but it also does make it easier for bad actors in various different forms to do things that they otherwise wouldn't have been able to do without the help of this technology. So it'll definitely be interesting to see over the coming years how this all plays out, and if safeguards are put in place, what those will look like. Just to move on to the next slides. So Leo, thinking about, okay, well, this is what Imperva showed in their report. We obviously produced our wasted ad spend report, which kind of shows that impact on marketers. But Could you drill down into that a bit deeper and talk about how this increasing prevalence of IVT is impacting marketers year on year?
Yeah, so I was actually thinking, so marketers rely heavily on data to make the right decisions. And you know what else relies heavily on data? Machine learning algorithms. And most advertising is becoming automated anyways. So you have this massive pressure around data quality, which represents the globe on the left. So in terms of how skewed data then impacts wasted costs, you have your overall wasted spend on invalid traffic, which, to be honest, is only a piece of the puzzle. So I think the bigger impact of invalid traffic is not just the fact that you're paying on worthless activity, it's that worthless activity is then fueling advertising algorithms to optimize for the same. It's imported into your CRM, which allows marketing teams and sales teams to follow on with fake data points that leads to wasted time, that leads to more wasted costs. And you just end up with this vicious cycle. So I think all in all, it's really these 3 points that I wanted to highlight. And then in the last report, we also referenced that based on the overall invalid traffic rates of 8.5% of all advertising activity is invalid, businesses across the world are looking to waste roughly around 71 billion in ad spend next year. And I think that is just scratching the surface. That is just the wasted spend aspect. So that number is supposedly much bigger when you take into account decisions being made based on those fake data points.
One of the really interesting things to come out of the report was the significant differences in IVT rates when you compare Google channels to non-Google channels, as shown on this slide. 5.5% average on Google channels and 17.5% on non-Google channels. For the full breakdown of these figures and what they represent, you can find that in the wasted ad spend report itself. But Leo, could you just give us a top level explanation of why Google is performing so much better than other networks here?
Yeah, I think, for starters, Google is processing a lot more data than most of the networks on the right. Last year, there was a report shared that Google was processing 8.5 billion searches a day, and Meta sees roughly around 22 billion visits each month. Keep in mind that majority of those visits are fake anyways. But I think the term invalid traffic was originally coined by Google, actually, because that was when most of the scrapers, crawlers, and so on, most of the bot activity was happening within these search engine platforms. And then also to add to that, Google have an entire knowledge base on invalid traffic, showing advertisers how to prevent it, educating them on the problem. Do keep in mind that most of this is dealing with generic and general invalid traffic, which the way we call it is yesterday's types of bots. It's the sophisticated invalid traffic that is becoming the problem nowadays. And I think that if you look at the representation on the right, most of these platforms like LinkedIn, Meta, Twitter, and so on, they're not equipped to deal with more sophisticated invalid traffic, whereas Google might be in a slightly better position. Still not ideal, but in a much better position compared to most social platforms.
And David, could you just touch on why, on a top level, why is this such a tough technological challenge to deal with and clamp down on sophisticated invalid traffic?
Yeah, because a lot of the analysis, especially to have impact, needs to be done, first of all, on a huge scale. And obviously, the more data you have, the more also like knowledge you have, and have to analyze, obviously, everything you can look at. Sometimes it can be harder for them to focus on specific things. And the other aspect of it is the real-timeness. So there's no initiative, no financial initiative for ad networks to be responding to these kind of things in real time, because it does get exponentially more expensive the less time you take to make a decision and to act on it. When we're talking compared like seconds to even minutes, we're talking probably factors of 10, if not more, in terms of cost, right? So there's no real initiative to be doing that.
Yeah, and the other point, Leo, I suppose, is just like is it the case that there is just the financial incentive just isn't there to come down aggressively on this?
I would say that definitely plays a role. As in, let's take Google for example, the smaller metric. So Google generated 224 billion in ad revenue last year. So 5.5% of that is roughly 12 billion. If Google had to decide to completely eliminate invalid traffic, that would cost them at least 12 billion, not to mention the investments in the technology and the workforce to deal with that. So I think that it's a longer route to actually go to reduce that, but it's going to be a cat and mouse chase, because as these platforms invest more into invalid traffic protection, bots also evolve to try and circumvent those measures.
Always the way, always the way. So following on from that, obviously the wasted ad spend report, as I mentioned, does give the full breakdown of where that 5.5% and 17.5% figure came from. The report also includes IVT rates broken down by industry, company size, by region. We just don't have the time to go into all those during this webinar, but all the data is available for you to review in the report for anyone who's interested. But just to quickly move on. So obviously, David, it's clear ad networks aren't detecting all invalid traffic. So could you talk us through how Lunio detects and blocks invalid traffic that ad networks don't catch?
So obviously with limitations of time and IP, I'm going to be focusing more on the bird's eye view, basically, on the macro of things. Google have, for example, limitations on what kind of data they can access on how their clients, especially when it comes into a financial conflict of interest with other ad platforms, which we don't have a conflict, because our only interest is to show as much transparency to the client. Even if we would see that the valid traffic is low, we will just show it to the client, and we do have those cases from time to time. Now, what we do analyze is we take the cybersecurity perspective, like we said, bots, network activity, client-side checks, but mostly behavioral analytics, and we combine them with a marketing efficiency perspective, which is taking the knowledge of obviously our founders and our team and trying to create a picture per industry of how does good traffic actually look like, and how far is the traffic that we analyze from the optimal traffic and from a good enough traffic. So when you combine those two together, this is how we make most of our decisions in Lunio about traffic.
Yeah, and that's basically what this diagram on the slide here is representing. Just conscious of time here, so Leo, I'm just going to move on, and if you could quickly, before I pass the question, I'll make the point that at Lunio, what we've been talking about today, we deal with invalid traffic at the post-click level, looking at the on-site behavior of each visit to determine its validity. Ad verification solutions like Integral Ad Science, who we partnered with on the report, they deal with pre-bid impression level data, primarily to maximize viewability and ad engagement rates before the ad is even served or before the click even occurs. But could you just very briefly run us through the advantage for marketers in pairing an IVT solution like Lunio with an ad verification solution like IAS?
Yeah, so I guess all the big advertisers should probably be using either IAS or Double Verify or some big ad verification platform, either directly or through a partnership. So if you're advertising on Meta, my understanding is IAS actually have a relationship with Meta or with Twitter or so on, or Twitter X, that's what it's called. Keep in mind that most of this data is pre-engagement. So at an impression level, and we're still able to pick up quite a lot of invalid activity coming through post-engagement. And again, that invalid activity, it's not that it kind of leaks through ad verification platforms. It's a different type of activity. And we're able, the reason why we're able to detect that so accurately is we can actually measure that engagement on the site as well. So we can see how these visitors behave and engage with your website to then generate those exclusion audiences, something that a lot of ad verifications are currently missing from. So having the two is quite a powerful two-layer combination.
For sure. And this slide, I think, will be particularly useful for anyone who wants to kind of take immediate action today to kind of reduce their exposure. So there's 4 different points on this slide, Leo. And if you could just talk us through these resources and strategies marketers can use to try and tackle IVT.
Yeah. So I guess the first one, we have billions and billions of data points that we've analyzed from our customer base to generate a list of 100,000 placements that you can exclude today within your Google Ads platform. And this is a combination of fraudulent display placements, but more often, some of these placements are actually quite popular and made for advertising websites where we've seen poor conversion rates. So this is something that you can do ASAP to reduce your IVT rates. The second point, I know it's something that David has brought up before. A very simple action that you can do is run a list of IP addresses that you believe might be fraudulent, or you want to double check against a website like abuseipdb.com. David, correct me if I'm wrong, I think there is a way of automating that with ChatGPT or creating a script that does that for you.
Yeah, you can definitely just be nice to it because bots will take over the world. Ask it politely to create a Python script that checks a list of IPs from a CSV using the free API of abuseipdb, and ChatGPT will usually just write the code for you.
Yeah, so there you go. You have a free open source, basic, but still a lot of manual effort included to detect and exclude those IP addresses. The third point is, and always for any advertiser, always try to turn off audience expansions and advertising partners. So unless you're looking to splurge money on reach and you don't really care, turn those off, optimize your existing niche audience. And then if you do want to, again, splurge some money out into a black hole, you can turn on audience exclusions or audience expansions. And we wouldn't recommend doing that without point number 4, which is using Lunio. So the way our customers work with Lunio is by using Lunio, it does everything of the above. So it generates IP exclusions and audience exclusions automatically, but it also gives you the confidence to then test out new audiences. So with Lunio in place, you can turn on audience expansions and test out partner networks, having the confidence that you have a platform that is going to filter that invalid traffic out for you. So this is a little bit more confidence into the marketing world to test out new advertising features.
Try and tackle some of those influx of fake lead submissions that we've seen through audience expansion. Yeah. So just going to move on. We've had a couple of questions come in the Q&A section. So I'm just going to first of all see if I can bring one of these on screen here. So the first question here from Jessica. So what is the end goal for those who are taking such lengths in creating IVT, fake users and fake leads? Why do you believe they are doing it and investing so much? David, if you want to address that first.
Yeah. So I'll quote Mr. Krabs from SpongeBob. It's money. It's a lot of money. It's huge amounts of money. So if you create a bot that you can show on POC on a small scale that will make, whether it's like a competitor or another platform lose money, you can sell it for a fraction of this money. That's what it is. Sometimes it's just interest, but usually when you see this on scale, it means that somebody is definitely paying for that to happen.
And Leo, is there anything that you add there? Or is it all financial?
I think most of it is financial. I will raise the point that there are cases where some of these bots are going to be scrapers. And again, it might be a financial aspect around those scrapers. It's not necessarily that they're making money by clicking your ads, but they might be scraping data. And the only way to scrape data is if they pretend that they're not a scraper so that these platforms cannot block you. So it's as if you have a scraper that's a real user clicking on your ads. And again, that is a form of invalid traffic. And I think that is something that we're going to see more and more because it's becoming harder to scrape and steal information from these platforms. So you have to find ways to disguise yourself.
So the next question is from Angelina. Do you see any challenges with measuring IVT when Privacy Sandbox starts rolling out. So David again.
Yeah, so we can already see some of the changes over the last few years, especially around third-party cookies. And Lunio was always a privacy-first company, and we tried to avoid using any kind of client-specific data or looking at data that we think that we could avoid using. So cookies were not used as part of our product and are currently not being used as part of our product for specification reasons. So those kind of changes will not necessarily impact us. Obviously, going forward, we cannot predict which exact changes will happen. One example of a challenging change that happened is Safari on iPhones, I think, started removing the identifiers for ad clicks, but there are other alternative identifiers that we can still use for analytics. So mainly because of the way that we deploy, and we have additional ways of deployment, which we have in case the first ones get into any kind of problems, we can still allow for first-party data to be saved and analyzed on behalf of our clients and bring them insights without having a privacy issue doing that. So there's quite a lot of things being done. I think like one of the biggest examples will be AWS Nitro Enclave, which promotes confidential computing as a service, which means that we could process your data without having access to it. But that is quite a bit in the future. So we are definitely ready for it. And if anything, we actually encourage Google to do it.
Leo, I think I'll direct this question to you. So I get how you can exclude IP addresses, but how can you create invalid traffic audiences?
I think the best way to answer this is think of the same way that you would create a retargeting audience or a conversion audience. So you have a number of pixels on your website. They listen to events. The way we work is we would just inform those pixels to say, hey, this visit is actually not real. Go create an exclusion audience. That is a simple way of putting it. The more fun answer, and I think for anyone that is curious to then sign up for an audience of Lunio, is you can actually look into those audiences and see a breakdown of their demographics, depending on the social platform that you're on. So there's a lot more insights that you can get from an audience being created rather than an IP list.
And you tend to see common themes and trends cropping up in those audiences, right?
Yes, it does vary per industry, but most commonly, yes. I think on Google Ads, you often see those audiences not having a lot of, not having much data around ages, geo, and so on. So if you look at the breakdown of invalid traffic audiences, you'll see that the majority of it is unknown in a sense. So again, that's maybe an action for advertisers to be more proactive around excluding audiences where ages and other parameters are unknown to the advertising platform.
So this question from Jeff, again, Leo, might be one for you here. Thanks, Jeff. Great presentation. Is the Lunio tool and IVT in general equally applicable to B2B as well as B2C? And what are the unique properties of each, if any? Leo?
Yeah, so the main one that comes to mind is dealing with fake leads. A big challenge in B2B is you're not typically feeding these advertising platforms with your ROAS data. All you're measuring is conversions with no real value or monetary number. So it's very difficult to understand whether those conversions are legitimate or not. By having Lunio in place, you should expect to see a reduction in fake leads coming through. And I think the reason why this is more important for B2B platforms is when you're dealing with platforms like LinkedIn or Meta that see high levels of fake leads, these platforms are going to try and optimize for more of the same. So especially at the beginning of a campaign launch during a learning period, I think this is where we've seen most of the benefit in having Lunio in place, which is every time you launch a new campaign, making sure that you have processes in place to just eliminate those leads from being part of your funnel.
Yeah, garbage in, garbage out, as always. Thank you, Leo. I think that's it. I think we'll wrap up there. But big thanks to you, Leo and David, for all those insights today. If you have any questions for us, Any further questions, you can contact us directly at hello@lunio.ai, and we'll be happy to help you there. As I mentioned in the intro of today's session, the next webinar in this series will be at the same time next Thursday with Leo and Dan from Lunio, and the focus will be on exploring the ins and outs of the Lunio platform itself and how you can get as much value as possible from it. So please do join us for that. Leo, if anyone is interested in trialing Lunio, could you let them know how they can do that?
Yeah, I mean, simply type in lp.lunio.ai/free trial, or scan the QR code. And yeah, scan the QR code, sign up. Tell you what, if you do sign up and you do follow up with a Robo Boogie reference, we might put in an extra gift in for you.
Nice, exciting stuff. Thank you, Leo. Lastly, big thanks to everyone for tuning in, either here at the live session or watching back on demand. We hope to see you again at the same time next Thursday. So take care, everyone, and best of luck with your ongoing campaigns.